You have got to be kidding me. I mean, you cannot make this up. The President of the United States, who is nearly 80 years old, is so rattled by a newspaper article noting that he appears tired and keeps a later public schedule that he erupts into a late-night online tantrum, hurling schoolyard insults at a reporter and screaming, literally in all caps, that he aced his cognitive exam. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. A major national newspaper reports observable facts about Trump's public behavior: fatigue, a lighter schedule, moments of apparent drowsiness, and instead of calmly rebutting it with evidence, he implodes, he lashes out, he attacks the journalist's appearance, he turns his own mental fitness into a viral spectacle. And honestly, it's pathetic. This is not what confidence looks like. This is what panic looks like. This is what happens when someone feels a nerve has been hit and they know it. Because think about this for a second. If none of this were true, if he were truly as sharp, energetic, and invincible as he claims, he could have ignored the story entirely. He could have released medical records. He could have sent out a dry, factual statement. That's what a secure leader does. But that's not what we saw. What we saw was a narcissistic injury playing out in real time, a public meltdown triggered by the suggestion of weakness, a man who has built his entire identity around the illusion of dominance, reacting with raw, unfiltered rage because someone dared to point out what millions of Americans can already see with their own eyes.
And here's the most important part. This isn't even a shocking or radical claim. The man is pushing 80. He has one of the most stressful jobs on planet Earth. Fatigue at that age isn't scandalous. It's human. The scandal is the reaction. The scandal is the fact that mere discussion of age and stamina sends him into a spiral so severe that he has to posture about perfect cognitive exams and attack a reporter's looks to soothe his own ego. That's not strength. That's insecurity laid bare. Make no mistake. This isn't about policy. This isn't about media bias. This is about image control. Trump has spent decades constructing this myth that he alone is the strongest, smartest, most energetic person in any room. And now that time itself is beginning to intrude on that fantasy, the mask is slipping. And when the mask slips, what you see underneath is not resolve, it's rage. If you're watching this and feeling like you're taking crazy pills, you're not alone. Because the gaslighting here is off the charts. We're being told that merely noticing age, something that applies to every single human being, is some kind of outrageous attack. We're supposed to pretend that pointing out visible exhaustion is fake news, that questioning stamina in a job that demands relentless energy is somehow treasonous. This isn't politics, this is gaslighting. And the meltdown itself proves the point. He didn't just respond, he erupted. He didn't just deny it, he tried to dominate the narrative by force of insult and volume. That tells you everything you need to know about how deeply this hit him. Because when you strike at someone's core insecurity, you don't get calm rebuttals, you get explosions. Let that sink in.
And that brings us to the part they desperately don't want you to focus on. The actual facts. Not the chest thumping, not the tantrum, not the all-caps bravado. The evidence. Because once you strip away the rage posting and the insults, what's left is a timeline of behavior that tells a very different story than the one Trump is trying to sell you. Here is what actually happened. A major national newspaper reported, based on public scheduling data, eyewitness accounts, and observable patterns, that Trump has been keeping a lighter public schedule and has appeared visibly fatigued during multiple appearances. That's not speculation, that's not rumor, that's documentation. Fewer rallies, shorter days, later start times, reduced travel tempo. These are not opinions, these are verifiable facts. And in October, during a widely attended public event, witnesses observed Trump appearing to nod off, eyelids heavy, posture slack, momentarily disengaged. Again, not a diagnosis, not a conclusion, an observation. And here's the part that matters. The article did not declare him unfit. It did not diagnose him with anything. It raised a basic, legitimate question about stamina and energy at an advanced age in a job that demands constant output. That's it. That's the entire provocation. So what did Trump do with that? Did he dispute the scheduling data? No. Did he clarify how many events he's doing per week? No. Did he provide medical documentation proactively to address public concern? No. Instead, he went straight to personal attack mode. He called the reporter ugly. He accused the paper of being radical. He declared his exam perfect. He made it about ego instead of evidence. That's the tell, because here's the reality they don't want you to see. When someone refutes facts, They bring counterfacts. When someone refutes narratives about themselves, they bring insults. That's the difference.
And notice how carefully the language shifts. It's not, here are my updated medical records, it's, I aced it. Not, here is my neurological assessment summary, it's, perfect cognitive test. That's not clinical language, that's branding language, that's salesmanship. That's Trump doing what Trump always does, trying to overpower scrutiny with superlatives instead of substance. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. The burden of proof is being inverted. Instead of Trump providing transparent, detailed medical documentation to reassure the public is being told that even asking the question is an attack. That is the definition of authoritarian narrative control. It's not prove me wrong, it's how dare you ask. And honestly, it's pathetic. Because we've been through this before. We've seen this movie. Remember the medical letter that read like it was written by a campaign copywriter? Remember the vague statements about being in excellent health with no accompanying data? Remember the repeated assertions of being the healthiest president ever while refusing to release full medical records? This is the same playbook. Absolute claims, zero transparency, attack the messenger. And here's the deeper contradiction they're hoping you won't connect. Trump wants to be treated as a strong man, as an unstoppable force of will, unmatched energy, relentless dominance. That is the brand. That is the mythology. But strong men do not melt down over newspaper articles. They do not lash out over neutral observations. They do not scream about exams unless they are afraid of the conclusion. Make no mistake, this reaction was not about the article. It was about the implication. The implication that time applies to him too. The implication that fatigue is catching up. The implication that the invincibility myth is cracking. And the more violently he reacts, the more he confirms that the implication landed.
And here's where the logic really collapses under its own weight. We are told, simultaneously, that Trump is operating at peak mental and physical condition. Any suggestion otherwise is fake news, but also that he must immediately and aggressively prove it through repeated public assertions and rage posts. Those three things cannot all be true at once. If condition is beyond question, the defense would not be this frantic. If stamina were obviously intact, the schedule would not be shrinking. If confidence were genuine, the response would be calm. Instead, we get performative overcompensation. He didn't just say it, he meant it. And the intensity of that denial is the story. And let's talk about the insult itself, because this matters. He didn't attack the reporting, he attacked the reporter's appearance. That is not incidental, that is not random. That is an impulse grounded in dominant psychology. When facts become uncomfortable, he doesn't argue them, he tries to dehumanize the source. It's a tactic as old as it is crude. If you can delegitimize the messenger personally, you don't have to engage with the message intellectually. This isn't politics. This is gaslighting, because now the conversation has been successfully shifted. Instead of talking about observable fatigue and schedule changes, we're talking about whether he was mean to a reporter. Instead of talking about stamina, we're talking about decorum. The substance gets buried under spectacle. That is the strategy. And honestly, it would almost be impressive if it weren't so dangerous. Now, let's dissect the cognitive exam claim, because this is where the sleight of hand becomes especially sloppy. Trump says he aced a cognitive test. But what test? When? Administered by whom? Under what standards? Was it a full neuropsychological battery or a brief screening tool? Was it independently verified? Was it released publicly? Of course not. There are no details, just the assertion. And in medicine, assertions without documentation are meaningless.
But here's the quieter truth they don't want you to hear. Passing a cognitive screening test does not refute fatigue. It does not refute stamina issues. It does not refute age-related decline in energy. It simply means you met a minimum threshold on a limited set of tasks at a single moment in time. That's it. That's the entire claim, and it is being wildly overstated for political theater. So what we are witnessing right now is not a medical defense, it is a branding maneuver. A man whose entire political power is built on the illusion of personal dominance is frantically reinforcing that illusion because it's being threatened by the most unstoppable force there is, biology. And that's the core insecurity that's been struck here, not ideology, not partisanship, identity. Trump's identity is not rooted in humility, expertise, or service. It is rooted in perceived superiority, stronger than you, smarter than you, tougher than you, always winning, always perfect, and age is the one variable that makes that narrative impossible to maintain indefinitely. You can spin scandals, you can spin losses, you cannot spin cellular aging forever. And that is why this reaction was so visceral. That is why it was so personal. That is why it was so cruel. Because you are watching a man rage against the one enemy he cannot sue, insult, or intimidate into submission: time. And now, because of that outburst, the very thing the article tentatively raised as a question has been magnified into a national conversation. He turned a single report into a multi-day scandal through pure ego. He lit the fire himself. But wait, it gets worse. Because this is not happening in isolation. This isn't a one-off bad day. This isn't a random overreaction. This is part of a much longer, much darker pattern. A pattern of how Trump reacts whenever his image of invincibility is threatened. A pattern of denial, projection, and counterattack that stretches back decades.
And once you recognize that pattern, this latest meltdown stops looking like an aberration and starts looking like exactly what it is: the system functioning as designed. Now, next phase, we'll zoom out and connect this directly to that historical pattern: how every perceived weakness is met with rage, how every factual challenge is met with retaliation, and how this psychological reflex has shaped entire national crises. This is the pattern. This is always the pattern. Anytime reality intrudes on the myth, anytime a crack appears in the armor, Trump does not adapt. He attacks. He doesn't correct. He retaliates. He doesn't reflect. He projects. And once you understand that, this entire episode snaps into focus as just the latest chapter in a very old psychological reflex. We've seen this movie over and over again. When his crowd sizes were questioned, he didn't provide objective comparisons. He sent his press secretary out to lie about the largest audience ever. When his business losses were exposed, he didn't release transparent financials. He sued, threatened, blustered, and boasted about being a billionaire anyway. When his policies failed, he didn't admit miscalculation. He blamed saboteurs, enemies, the deep state, the media, immigrants, governors, scientists, judges. There is always an external villain because the internal truth is intolerable. Make no mistake, this is not random temperament. This is strategy fused with pathology. It is a system of self-preservation built on denial and aggression. Every weakness must be reframed as strength. Every exposure must be punished. Every doubt must be crushed under volume and intimidation. And now age, naturally, inevitably, has entered that same battlefield. What happened after the NYT report follows the exact template that psychologists and political analysts have documented for years: perceived threat to self-image, immediate rage, personal attack, counter-myth creation, loyalists mobilized to attack the media, and then the rewriting of reality itself: perfect exam, fake news, radical reporter. The same cycle, the same mechanics. Different trigger.
Because Trump cannot tolerate symbolic loss. He cannot tolerate the idea that he is diminishing in any way. To him, decline is not just biological, it is existential. It is annihilation of the brand, and the brand is the only thing that has ever mattered. This is why every single discussion of his age produces disproportionate fury. It's not because the question is unfair, it's because it is unbeatable. He can litigate scandals, he can manipulate markets, he can intimidate officials, he can lie about crowd size and net worth and election results, but he cannot bully the calendar, and that terrifies him. You can actually trace this exact reflex back through multiple public crises. When COVID shattered the image of total control, he pivoted instantly from "it's under control" to "it's a hoax" to "miracle cures" to "it's the governor's fault," all because the virus made him look small. When the election outcome contradicted his self-image as an eternal winner, he didn't adapt. He detonated a lie so massive it nearly tore the country apart. Because to accept defeat would have been to accept fallibility, and fallibility is incompatible with his identity. This is the heart of the danger. Trump does not simply seek power, he seeks confirmation of invincibility, and any data point that contradicts that fantasy is treated not as information, but as an attack that must be destroyed. Now add age into that frame and you see the true scale of the problem. Age is the one variable that not even authoritarian control can indefinitely suppress. It produces unavoidable signals: fatigue, slower movement, reduced endurance, altered schedule.
These are not political constructs, these are biological outputs. And once those outputs become visible, they undermine the mythology at a fundamental level. So what you saw in that truth social outburst was not just petty insult, it was existential panic. The system detected threat, and the system executed retaliation.
And here's where it becomes especially disturbing. Because the same reflex that produces a reporter insult also produced the attempt to overturn an election. The same refusal to accept limitation that produces rage about aging also produced mass denial about a deadly pandemic. The same instinct to crush uncomfortable truth at any cost is exactly what makes this moment dangerous at a societal scale. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. This is not about whether Trump is sleepy one afternoon. This is about whether someone who cannot tolerate even symbolic decline can be trusted with real decline, real limitations, real crises, real deterioration. Because leadership is not about pretending to be immortal. It is about managing fragility responsibly. And everything about this reaction proves the opposite. Now, zoom out further. Look at how his supporters are being coached to process this. First, the denial, he's fine. Then the attack, the media is evil. Then the myth, he aced it. Then the deflection, what about the other guy? This isn't organic debate. This is mass narrative conditioning. A coordinated effort to override sensory input, what people can literally observe with ideological loyalty. They are saying the quiet part out loud. You are not to trust your eyes. You are not to trust observable schedule changes. You are not to trust public behavior. You are to trust only the declared myth of perfection. That is cult psychology. That is not politics. And it carries consequences far beyond one news cycle. Because here's the brutal truth. If a leader cannot psychologically tolerate the concept of decline, then what happens when decline becomes unavoidable? What happens when stamina can no longer be faked? What happens when energy cannot be artificially inflated with bluster? What happens when the body dictates boundaries that the ego refuses to acknowledge?
History gives us the answer. Leaders who deny limitation do not slow down. They do not delegate, they do not soften. They escalate, they tighten control, they lash outward, they externalize blame, they radicalize their surroundings to protect the myth of personal dominance. And that is exactly the phase Trump is visibly entering now. You can already see it, the schedule shrinking while the rhetoric hardens, the physical visibility decreasing while the verbal aggression increases. The more the body shows limitation, the more the language compensates with absolutism. Perfect, best, strongest, total. It's not coincidence, it's compensation. And here's the part they really don't want you to understand. This is not just happening to Trump. It is happening to the movement that depends on him, because the movement is built on projection, on the fantasy that he is the avatar of unstoppable will. As soon as that projection weakens, the entire structure becomes psychologically unstable. So every supporter must now participate in defending the mythology not just for him, but for themselves. Their identity is tied to his strength. That's why even mild reporting now produces extreme reaction. Because what's actually being defended is not a man, it's an ideological self-image. And that is why this moment matters far more than a petty insult, because it reveals how brittle the system has become, how dependent it is on denial, how unable it is to metabolize neutral reality without turning it into persecution. This isn't politics, this is the psychology of power under threat. And that brings us to the real danger moving forward. Because when leaders begin to experience decline, but cannot acknowledge it, they do not adapt responsibly. They destabilize their environment to avoid confronting the truth. They create crises to reaffirm relevance. They provoke conflict to reassert centrality. We have seen this pattern in authoritarian regimes across decades and continents. Aging strong men do not gently fade. They harden, they burn. They take systems down with them rather than admit limitation.
And Trump's meltdown over something as banal as a schedule report is the psychological fingerprint of that exact trajectory.
If he cannot tolerate a newspaper noting fatigue, what will he tolerate when the constraints become structural? What will he do when reality no longer yields to branding? What will happen when the gap between myth and body becomes too wide to bridge with all caps assertions? That is the question this moment forces us to confront. This isn't about ageism. This isn't about mockery. This is about capacity, accountability, and the stability of a democracy that cannot afford leaders who treat biological reality as an enemy to be dominated. And now we arrive at the most dangerous part of all, the endgame. Because if this behavior continues unchecked, the consequences will not stay contained to social media meltdowns or insult-driven news cycles. They will move into policy, into institutions, into crisis response, into national stability itself. This is the endgame. This is where the psychology stops being a personality story and becomes a national security risk. Because when you combine unchecked ego, denial of limitation, and the absolute power of the presidency, you don't just get embarrassing meltdowns, you get system-level instability. You get a leader who cannot process weakness without converting it into conflict. And conflict, when generated from insecurity at the top, doesn't stay symbolic. It turns into law. It turns into force. It turns into irreversible damage. Let's be extremely clear about what's happening here. We are watching a public figure who is visibly struggling with the most universal human truth, decline, and who is responding not with acceptance, planning, or transparency, but with hostility, myth-making, and retaliation. That alone would be tragic at a personal level, but at a presidential level, it is dangerous, because the presidency does not allow room for the psychological luxury of denial. Reality does not negotiate with ego.
Here is the nightmare scenario this behavior creates. When a leader refuses to acknowledge limitation, every future crisis must be reframed as an external attack to preserve the illusion of strength. That means pandemics become conspiracies, elections become theft, courts become enemies, journalists become traitors, biology itself becomes a political adversary. And once that framing locks in, everything becomes warfare. Facts, institutions, truth. All of it is treated as hostile territory to be dominated rather than reality to be managed. Make no mistake, democracies do not collapse because of one dramatic event. They unravel when leaders teach millions of people to reject observable reality in favor of emotional loyalty. When you normalize the idea that cameras lie, schedules lie, data lies, witnesses lie, but only one man tells the truth, you are not governing. You are training a population to live inside a controlled narrative. And once that line is crossed, every future safeguard becomes optional in the eyes of believers. And now add age and decline into that equation, because sooner or later, the body always wins. Energy diminishes, endurance narrows, the margin for error shrinks. And for most people, that creates humility, it creates caution, it creates delegation. But in Trump's psychology, it creates escalation. The more the body signals limits, the more the rhetoric compensates with absolutism. The weaker the physical reality becomes, the stronger the narrative must become to mask it. That is not speculation. That is visible in real time. The quieter the schedule, the louder the attacks. The shorter the public days, the longer the rage posts. The fewer the appearances, the more extreme the language. This is the classic pattern of overcompensation. And overcompensation at the presidential level does not produce calm. It produces instability.
And here is the part that should chill everyone, regardless of party. Leaders who cannot psychologically tolerate decline tend to manufacture crises, not always consciously, but functionally. They provoke, they polarize, they create emergency atmospheres because chaos restores the feeling of centrality. In chaos, they are once again the indispensable figure, the strongman, the decider, the focal point of all fear and attention. Calm exposes weakness. Crisis conceals it. If you are watching this unfold and thinking, this seems familiar, you're right. History is full of aging rulers who responded to decline not with adaptation, but with crackdowns, purges, and reckless decisions. Not because they were evil supervillains, but because their identity could not survive the truth of limitation. So they reshaped reality to avoid confronting it. And that is the terrifying reality of the future if this continues unchecked. It means a presidency increasingly driven not by policy outcomes, but by narcissistic preservation. It means decisions filtered not through expertise, but through what protects the leader's self-image in that moment. It means institutions pressured not for efficiency, but for loyalty. It means dissent, framed not as disagreement, but as existential threat. We are already seeing early warning signs. Judges treated as enemies, prosecutors labeled as political hitmen, journalists dehumanized, scientists attacked, military leadership tested for loyalty. Every independent system is slowly reframed as an adversary if it produces information that clashes with the mythology of perfection. This isn't politics. This is gaslighting at the scale of a nation. Because the quiet truth underneath all of it is painfully simple. A presidency demands adaptability. It demands the ability to recognize limits, to plan for succession of responsibility, to build resilient systems that do not depend on one man's self-concept. And everything about this meltdown tells us the opposite is happening. We are being asked to hinge the stability of democracy on a personality that cannot tolerate neutral observation without erupting. That is not sustainable.
And this is where the audience comes in. Because the most dangerous phase of democratic erosion is not the top-down assault. It is the moment when the public grows accustomed to the distortion, when exhaustion replaces outrage, when abnormal becomes background noise, when rage posts become just how he is. That normalization is what allows institutional decay to look boring instead of alarming. If you are feeling unsettled right now, that is a rational response. Because what you are witnessing is not just an insecure reaction to a news story. You are witnessing how power behaves when it feels its own limits approaching. And power under threat does not become gentle. It becomes desperate. Let that sink in. This was never about a single article. It was about a psychological rupture between myth and reality. The article merely touched the nerve. The reaction exposed the system. And the system we're watching now is one that survives only through confrontation, fabrication, and escalation. So here is the real call to vigilance. Do not get distracted by the insult of the day. Do not let the spectacle replace the substance. Watch the patterns. Watch the shrinking tolerance for truth. Watch the expanding definition of enemy. Watch the increasing need for crisis to sustain relevance. These are not entertainment trends. They are structural warning signs. Democracy does not require perfect leaders. It requires accountable ones. Leaders who can hear uncomfortable facts without converting them into vendettas. Leaders who can accept limits without declaring war on reality itself. And right now, we are seeing the opposite play out in slow motion. Make no mistake, this trajectory does not correct itself. It only intensifies unless checked by institutions, law, and an informed public that refuses to surrender shared reality for emotional loyalty. And that is where this truly ends. Not with a punchline, not with a rage post, not with another all-caps assertion of perfection. It ends with a test of whether a democracy can still recognize danger even when it arrives wrapped in spectacle, tribalism, and denial. And that test is not abstract. It is happening now.